Hello everyone. In this video I'll be discussing the complete genetic history of the Iranian peoples. So not only the people of what is today Iran, but also the inhabitants of modern-day Afghanistan, as well as Tajikistan and other Iranian speakers in nations such as Pakistan and the nations of the Caucasus, notably Azerbaijan and Georgia. So please do look forward to the rest of this video, and right now I will suggest that you watch all of this video, because this video will cover it will cover the entire history, the genetic history of the Iranian peoples, and this will be the foremost video for Iranian genetics on the internet, I can assure you. So please do watch all of it and share it among your friends as well as your colleagues, relatives, whatever, because I think that I have been working towards this for the past few months and have been doing a lot of research, and I decided to release this video today, even though I was going to wait for my 1 year anniversary. I thought it's best that I get the video out before then, so that I just think it's best that the message gets out there as soon as possible. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And in this video I will be covering autosomal breakdowns, I will be using PCA charts, I will be referencing many studies, and I'll be also taking a look at Iranian haplogroups based on a study from 2012. And please do look forward to that. Thank you. All of the sources used for this video will be referenced not only in the description but also in the comment section. So please do take a look at those sources, and if you cannot access them, please email me at my email, which is irantalk95@gmail.com, and I will give you each and every one of the sources listed in the description. Thank you. And a final word here is that I'd like to thank all of my loyal supporters and subscribers who have been with me for a very long time. So without further ado, I shall begin right now. The very first inhabitants of what is today Iran, specifically the Iranian plateau, were farmers, and these farmers emerged in the Zagros mountains sometime during the Neolithic. The Neolithic Iranian farmers. Now, they were not Iranic speakers, since the Iranian languages arrived into Iran at a later date from Central Asia, but nonetheless, these Iranian farmers formed the basis of the modern Iranian genome, and their origins were largely from a basal Eurasian type population admixing with some sort of pre-existing West Eurasian population. Now, it's not really sure what this population was, as we do not have such samples available, but nonetheless, the Neolithic Iranian farmers were heavily basal Eurasian derived, and the basal Eurasians were one of the first humans out of Africa. And this is very notable, even though they were not sub-Saharan Africans and were actually quite distinct from them. They nonetheless split off from the what is today the modern day African population, the ancestors of the modern day African populations, thousands of years before the emergence of sub-Saharan Africans. And that's what's interesting here. And these basal Eurasians would go on to contribute genetically to much of the contemporary as well as ancient populations of the Near East. The genetic origins of the Neolithic Iranian farmers were first uncovered in the 2016 study from Lazaridis, Iosif Lazaridis, which looked at the native farmer populations of the Near East, where farming emerged. The article was titled "Genomic Insights into the Origin of Farming in the Ancient Near East." And what this study concluded was that farming was discovered in the ancient Near East twice at around the same time during the Neolithic period. And basically, I think the original farming population, one of the first were the Natufians, who contributed significantly to the genetic makeup of the modern day Saudis and Arabs, mostly Semites. And the other population discovered were the Neolithic Iranians, and these farmers contributed significantly to contemporary populations of Iran and South Asia, as well as those of the Caucasus and Central Asia as well. In fact, it was these Neolithic Iranian farmers who later brought civilization to the Indus Valley Basin, migrating there from Iran and establishing the Indus Valley civilization, which was one of the earliest civilizations in world history. And that civilization, the groundwork for that civilization, was laid down by the Neolithic Iranian farmers. Now, one of the earliest civilizations to emerge from the Neolithic Iranian farmers, well, the material cultures here, the most notable is Ganj Dara, and that's the site from where most of these samples were found. It's located in southwestern Iran, and it was actually these Neolithic farmers who would later hybridize during the Chalcolithic period with a population which was most similar to Chalcolithic Anatolians. The Neolithic period in Iran lasted from around 9000 BCE to 6000 BCE, after which the Chalcolithic period emerged. So the Copper Age, and it was during this period that the Chalcolithic Iranians emerged, again from the aforementioned admixture between the Neolithic Iranians as well as the Chalcolithic Anatolians, and this led the Iranian population, so the Chalcolithic Iranians, to gain minor Levantine related as well as Western hunter gatherer admixture by way of these Chalcolithic Anatolians. And these Chalcolithic Iranians form around 65 to 75% of the modern Iranian genome, and this is very significant because this proves that much of the ancestry found among the modern day Iranian population is indeed native to the Iranian plateau and does not come from the outside, as was often asserted by the detractors of the Iranian nation. And most Iranians actually are not heavily admixed with the Semites, South Asians, or East Asians, as is again commonly believed by the enemies of Iran Shah. These Chalcolithic Iranians were actually responsible for many great ancient civilizations, most notably the BMAC culture, and while the people of the BMAC were not wholly Chalcolithic Iran derived, they were nonetheless of Neolithic and Chalcolithic Iranian stock. And it was not only the populations of the BMAC, but also there were many material cultures within Iran itself which were derived, which were rather created by these Chalcolithic Iranian farmers, most notably the Halmand and Giraffe cultures, which is very interesting as those cultures were quite prominent, and also the Elamite culture. The Elamites were probably likely mostly of Neolithic Iranian descent as well, though they could have had partial late Neolithic Iranian ancestry, which is best represented here by the Hutu cave sample from northern Iran. Now, the reason why I say that is because the modern day boundaries seem to have a decent amount of late Neolithic Iranian ancestry, and their location corresponds mostly to where the Elamites were based. So that is possible as well, though we need genetic confirmation on the Elamites, and we, for the time being, do not have any Elamite samples. But nonetheless, it can be said that the Elamites were neither African nor Semitic derived. Now, before I move on to the arrival of the Iranics into the plateau as well as the genetic composition of the BMAC peoples, I would like to discuss the genetic another population which contributed significantly to the modern day Iranian genome, around 20 to 25%, and as high as 30%. And this population was the Proto-Indo-Europeans who emerged on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Now, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya people, the original, you could say, these are the original speakers of Proto-Indo-European. These individuals were derived from a population which was very similar to the Neolithic Iranian farmers known as the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, and these Caucasus hunter-gatherers rather hybridized with the populations, the native populations of Eastern Europe known as the Eastern hunter-gatherers to form the Yamnaya people. And they were largely maternally they were of Caucasus hunter-gatherer descent, and paternally they were of Eastern hunter-gatherers. And these Eastern hunter-gatherers largely migrated into the Caucasus and admixed with the native women. And from this, you had the Yamnaya peoples, who then migrated into Europe and admixed with the native European farmers, who themselves were derived from Anatolian farmers and from the native Western hunter gatherers. And this is quite interesting because while these farmers originated from the Middle East, they migrated into Europe and admixed with the native populations, and then these European farmers admixed with the Yamnaya people to form the the Proto-Indo-Iranians, as well as the speakers of various other Indo-European languages. The ancestors to the speakers of various other Indo-European languages. Now, these Proto-Indo-Iranians then migrated eastwards into Central Asia and formed the Sintashta culture, from which arose the Andronovo culture. And the Andronovo culture is believed by many scholars to be ancestral to the Indo-Iranians, who then migrated into Iran and India. Now, you may be wondering, if this is the case, wouldn't that confirm the old notion that the early Iranics, notably the Persians, Medes, Sogdians, as well as the Vedic Aryans, were largely of Nordic ancestry and were comparable to modern day Europeans? Well, the answer to that is no, because we have samples from the BMAC horizon as well as from Iron Age and Bronze Age South Asia, proving that the Vedic Aryans as well as the early Iranics most likely were already mixed by the time they reached the Iranian plateau, whereas the Vedic Aryans were probably not that admixed by the time they reached South Asia, but nonetheless they had probably a degree of admixture from the BMAC horizon. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that this is where we discuss the BMAC culture, and this is where the influence of the BMAC culture on the early Iranics comes up. The inhabitants of the BMAC culture, which it was located in Central Asia, were largely of Neolithic Iranian stock, with minor admixture from Chalcolithic Iranians and minor steppe admixture as well. And these BMAC peoples created a great civilization, often referred to as the Oxus civilization. And it was these individuals who would later hybridize with the native with these Proto-Indo-Iranians who were largely again of they were mostly resembling modern day Northern Europeans, though still fairly distinct from them. And the matter that really comes up here is that these Proto-Indo-Iranians mixed with these native Iranian populations to form a hybrid population, which was largely unlikely closest to the contemporary Yagnobi peoples, who may resemble Nordics phenotypically, well, not Nordics, but Europeans. And despite this, they mostly are a mixture of these early Proto-Indo-Iranians as well as the native populations of the BMAC, and are not at all Europeans, as is often falsely asserted by individuals such as Jason Reza Georgiani. Now, the evidence for this process, which I call BMACization, has been discussed in many articles, scholarly articles, notably a few from Harvard University. And I will attach all these articles in the description so that you have access to them. But anyways, the main article here was the recent study which was released in March 2017. Well, it's currently in preprint rather, but this study sequenced around 362 genetic samples from the BMAC horizon, and these samples proved that the native populations of the BMAC were partially steppe admixed, though mostly of native Iranian stock. And then when the Proto-Indo-Iranians migrated into Central Asia before migrating into Iran, they admixed with the native populations to form the early Iranics as well as the Vedic Aryans. The preprint in question is actually titled "The Genomic Formation of South and Central Asia," and it was by Vagesh Narasimhan. And I have attached it in the description as well as in the comment section of this video. So please do take a look at that and download the preprint. It's very informative and definitely worth checking out. Anyway, once these native populations of the BMAC hybridized with the Proto-Indo-Iranians, they formed a population again which was very similar to the Yagnobi peoples and would likely cluster with somewhere with those Kangju samples, which came from another study which I will get to very soon. And it was then these early Iranics who migrated into Iran and had mixed with the native Iranian Chalcolithic farmers to form the modern day Iranian population. And also the BMAC peoples contributed significantly to the genetic makeup of the peoples of the Eastern Iranics rather, and these Eastern Iranics, so today's Pashtuns as well as Yagnobis, Tajiks are mostly ancestrally derived from these populations, specifically these BMAC populations, and they do have a great degree of steppe admixture as well, and hence why they do not cluster with modern day Iranians, but rather South Central Asians and especially uppercase South Asians, though I will get into that later. So again, the BMAC populations form a significant basis for the modern day Iranian populations, the genetic basis of the modern day Iranian peoples. Now, moving on, before I get into haplogroups, I would just like to discuss that there were likely two migrations from two steppe-based migrations into Iran. Obviously, one was the migration of the early Iranics, and the other migration largely and likely stemmed from the Caucasus. And this migration was most likely characterized by a Caucasian population, which was probably heavily steppe derived as well and came from the late Mycop horizon, as well as the late Kura-Araxes horizon. Now, while the samples are not shown here on this PCA, David's PCA, by the way, this is what I am using. It is from Davitsky of Eurogenes, who has done an excellent job uncovering the genetic origins of the Eastern Iranics, as well as Western Iranics, Europeans, and South Central Asians, mainly focusing on the spread of the Indo-European languages. So please do check out his blog. The study which took a look at these populations, these Caucasian populations, is known as the genetic prehistory of the Greater Caucasus, and it basically looked at the late steppe populations which migrated into the Mycop horizon, as well as the populations of the Kura-Araxes culture. And this is another excellent source which proves the genetic continuity within Iran, as most of these populations do cluster with most of these Kura-Araxes populations rather samples rather do cluster with the contemporary Iranians, which is showcased here by this PCA from the article, and it's another one definitely worth checking out. So please do take a look at this, and this is very recent actually. It's from May 16th of this year. So yeah, definitely check out this article. And once the samples are released, it's likely that contemporary populations of northwestern Iran, such as the Azeris, as well as the native Iranian populations of the Caucasus, notably the Tats, as well as the Ossetians, derive most of their ancestry from these people, so the people of the Kura-Araxes culture, and I think the Kurds would rather fall under that category as well. Now moving on, we get into now I will get into another important population here, and that is obviously the other major study which came out this year, and this study took a look at the Tian Shan nomads. Now, the most notable of these nomads were the most relevant to Iranians were the Kangju people, who were likely largely derived from the Sogdians, or were mostly, or rather, were the Sogdians themselves. Now, these Kangju nomads largely were of West Eurasian stock, and were around the similar proximities derived from a steppe source as well as a BMAC source. Hence why they cluster rather in between these two populations. And these Kanju peoples, minus their minor 3 to 10% East Asian admixture, likely represent what the early Iranics look like. So these Kanju peoples are representative of the early Iranics, and I also think that they are pretty representative of the ancient Eastern Iranics. So the Khwarezmians, the not the Scythians, I'll get into them soon, but the Khwarezmians, the Sogdians, as well as the Bactrians, I would say so. So yeah, that's something else which is quite remarkable, and something definitely to take into account here. The study dealing with these populations was actually published this year as well. I know this has been an excellent year for Iranian genetics, and the study that it was published this year, and it took a look at steppe nomads, and it was published in the journal Nature by it was led by one of the most foremost geneticists, Peter de Barros Damgard, and he took a look at these populations, and he unquestionably proved that these genomes, these 137 genomes, which were from across the Eurasian steppes, that they represented this population, and these rather not population, but these 137 genomes, he took a look at. Most of them were largely East Asian nomads with partial ancestry from the west, with partial West Eurasian ancestry. But the key population here were the Kangju people, and they were from Central Asia, from the very eastern part of what is today Central Asia. And these samples proved that there was limited East Asian admixture in Central Asia, in Iranian Central Asia, in the prior to the Mongol expansions, as well as the Turkic rather expansions into the region. So the study, which I have attached in the description as well as the comment section, is also worth taking a look at. Now, some of these studies are not available, but if you really want them, please just email me at my email, and I will get them to you as soon as possible. And another thing I forgot to mention here is that actually samples from the Alans, so the Alans were an Eastern Iranian tribes which later migrated into Europe, notably into what is today Iberia. The Allens were sequenced as a part of the study as well, and it was found that most of these Allen samples actually clustered with contemporary Near Eastern and Caucasian populations. By Near Eastern, it was obviously not the Semites, but rather the Iranians, as well as populations of the Caucasus, notably the Azeris, the Georgians, the Armenians, and also the Ossetians, and that's fairly interesting as well. Although there were a few outliers, one which clustered with the South Central Asians, and another which clustered with the Europeans. The main point here is that the majority of these samples clustered with the contemporary Iranians and Caucasian populations, proving that even the Alans, who have been described by historians as having very fair skin and light hair, despite that they nonetheless were mostly a Caucasian population derived from the native Iranian populations as well as the native populations of the Caucasus, which were closely related. So that's very interesting as well. And it also debunks the notion that the aliens were actually a European people, and often they are used to prove the supposed Europeanness of the ancient Iranians, when in reality that's not at all the case. So that's also something interesting to take into account here. And now I will be taking a look at a Scythian study. There were two studies in which Scythian samples were featured in. The first one was released in 2017, and the second one is a Damgard study from this year. So yes, that study also included Scythian samples. Now, what's interesting here is that the Scythians showed little to no native Iranian admixture and were largely of Andronovo descent, with around 20 to 50% East Asian derived admixture mediated through the maternal line. And this was first discovered in Reich's 2017 study, which was titled Ancestry and Demography and descendants of Iron Age nomads of the Eurasian steppe. And this study actually was the first study taking a look at Scythian genetics, but not only Scythian genetics, as well as the genetics of the Sarmatians. And this study found, again, as I previously mentioned, that Scythians were mostly of Andronovo stock with very little native Iranian influence. Well, not Iranian, by that I mean the native populations of what is today Iran, the Iranian farmers. But the interesting thing again here is that they had a significant East Asian admixture and thus were again not Europeans. And another interesting thing here is that the Sarmatians actually had very little East Asian influence, and they did have minor native Iranian influence as well from the Iranian farmers, likely mediated through the BMAC culture, or possibly in the Caucasus. That is unknown for the moment. And at the same time, however, despite this, they did again mostly derive their ancestry largely from an Andronomo source. But again, what's interesting here is that they did not, and do not cluster with the Europeans, and largely cluster in between Europeans, Northern Europeans, and South Central Asians, specifically Yagnobis, and the closest population they cluster with are actually the modern day Volga Tatars, and that's fairly interesting, but it's not that surprising. But nonetheless, even the Sarmatians were not wholly Europeans, though likely phenotypically they had a very European appearance, and this again can be attributable to their high steppe related ancestry from the Andronovo horizon. And the similar conclusion was reached in Damgard study, which took a look at the Saka samples. These were the Asian Scythians, and again it found that most of their DNA was West Eurasian derived, but they still had a significant East Asian admixture as well. A final thing I wanted to discuss here is that we also have a sample from the Iron Age in Iran, and it clusters pretty much with modern day Iranians. We also have Bronze Age Iranian samples, and they do cluster in the vicinity of the modern day Iranics as well. And then we also have samples from the 1500s in Iran. And again, this one sample also clusters with the contemporary Iranians. And this is remarkable, proving the genetic continuity in Iran since the Iron Age, and proving individuals such as Jason Reza Jorjani wrong in their claims in regards to the genetic stability of Iran. Mongol and Arab, as well as Turkic admixture in Iran is actually very limited, exceeding no more than 5 to 10% in average, and with some populations, some individuals do have more than that, but the average is around to 5% total foreign admixture in Iran, and most of this actually comes from the later East Asian migrations, which significantly impacted the Azeri population, who derive around 7 to 10% of their ancestry from this source. And in southern Iran, most of it comes from Semitic expansions, likely during the ancient period, but from the Islamic period, there is really no more than 2 or 3% Semitic related admixture in Iran. And here are the calculations I did with the Davidsky's Global K25 calculator, and they show that most of the ancestry in Iran is actually native, derived from BMAC as well as steppe populations, and most of the foreign admixture exceeds no more than 10%, and the Semitic related admixture is here represented by the Natufian, and the East Asian related ancestry is represented by the Mongolian, and everything else is native. And in all the Iranian populations, you can clearly see that there is 90 to 95% genetic continuity since the Iron Age. And this goes for the population of contemporary Iran now. This is for most of the population, not including minorities such as the Baluchis, the Arabs in the southwest, as well as the Turkmen and some Azeris. But for the most part, Iranians have 90 to 95% genetic continuity since the Iron Age. And now I will get into the haplogroups and the situation of the haplogroups found in Iran. However, before I do that, I just like to discuss about the Eastern Iranics. The Eastern Iranics are still fairly much genetically stable, though they have picked up 5 to 10% and as high as 20% ancestry from an East Asian source, as well as a native South Asian source, though that can actually be ancient, attributed to ancient migrations from the Indus Valley civilization into the BMAC horizon, of which we have ample evidence of, as a few Indus Valley civilization inhabitants were actually found in the BMAC sites, and they were sequenced. So that's also something which is very interesting. But nonetheless, Eastern Iranics are fairly stable and not at all heavily admixed with a native South Asian element, which peaks in South India and is found at its lowest frequencies rather among the highest castes of Indo-Aryan origin, at around 20 to rather 15 to 20%, and I myself actually have around 18 to 22% of this admixture. So yeah, that's because of my uppercase origins, and that is actually one of the lowest in South Asia. I believe only the Jats as well as the Kalash have lower among the Indic speakers. But anyways, this video is discussing Iranics and not Indics. So now I will get into the haplogroup situation in Iran. Now all of the data on Iranian Y haplogroups comes from a 2012 study by Grugni, and this study looked at the Y DNA of Iranian populations across Iran. And I will thoroughly analyze this study right now here, because I have not taken a look at haplogroups in any of my videos, and I think it is necessary to do so. Now, haplogroups cannot compete with autosomal admixture or PCA projections, so they do not rather really show the full picture of genetics, but nonetheless they are good indicators of ancestry, paternal ancestry, direct paternal ancestry rather. And these haplogroups, what they show is the direct paternal line of an individual, so through their father's line, not anything other than that. And each individual only has one paternal haplogroup, not multiple paternal haplogroups, but rather only one paternal haplogroup. Now, while all autosomal DNA has shown 90 to 95% genetic continuity in the Iranian population, these haplogroups again show something very similar, but it is much more diverse than that. And the most notable haplogroup in the Iranian population, which according to this study occurs at 22.5%, is J2, and this is the native Iranian haplogroup from the native Iranian farmers, though it's not the only one associated with them, as E as well as G has been associated with the native Iranian farmers as well, but this occurs as it at a total of 22.5%. Moving on, the next most common is R1A, which is from the rather the Proto-Indo-European, so from Central Asia and the early Iranics, and this occurs at around 14.3% among the Iranian population. And after this at 10.1% is R1B, and R1B is the haplogroup which came from the population of the Caucasus into Iran. So the native population of the Caucasus herders who migrated into Iran, and that again occurs at 10.1%. And in total, the haplogroup R, all different clades, occur at 27.3%, and in total this actually outnumbers the J2, but overall the specific clade of J2 is more numerous than haplogroup R among the Iranian population. The Semitic related haplogroup J1 occurs at 8.9% on average among the Iranian population, though very limited of this, though most of this rather can be attributed to early Semitic expansions, and only a limited can be attributed to the Arab conquests. Now, the likely amount is around 2% because the Arab haplogroup J13CD was not tested, but if it was, it wouldn't have exceeded more than 2%. Nonetheless, most of J1 is actually concentrated in the province of Avaz, where it occurs at around 31.3%. J1 is also found at a differing degree among the Semitic populations of, not, sorry, not the Semitic populations, but among the Zoroastrians. And this is also quite interesting, and this proves that most of it cannot be attributed to the Arab conquest, of which I feel only 2% really can, and the majority actually comes from pre-Islamic Semitic, prehistoric even, Semitic expansions into Iran. And I think that is what this is. Moving forward, the haplogroup related from the G, haplogroup G occurs in 11.7% of the Iranian population, and most of this is again from native farmer expansions, likely from the Chalcolithic Anatolians who migrated into Iran and hybridized with the Neolithic Iranian farmers. Now finally, the Turkic haplogroup Q occurs at 5.8% in the Iranian population, and most of it is actually among the Turkmen, and that is it pretty much, as well as among the Azeris as well. Aside from that, it doesn't really occur in much of the remainder of the Iranian population, only the Turkic speakers mostly. Afro-Iranian haplogroup, E1, B1, A1 is only found among the Bandaris and the Afro-Iranians, and it's very limited overall. But aside from that, it's not really found in much of the Iranian population. It's found among the Baluch as well, and the Gashmi from Hormuzgan. But aside from these populations, it's not really found. All other remaining clades of E found in Iran are West Eurasian clades of the haplogroup and not African clades, and they also do not occur at great frequencies. The ones that do occur at great frequencies are also found among the European, Southern European populations, and they also do not really occur more than around 4% in total. So again, E is very limited in Iran, and that's pretty much it for the haplogroup picture in Iran. So the genetic haplogroups, as well as all the haplogroup charts. So here's the chart for J1. Again, J1C3 prove that foreign admixture among the Iranian population is very, very limited. And while haplogroups are not the best representative of this, nonetheless, they do contribute to this picture of genetic continuity in Iran since the Iron Age. And this is further buttressed by all of the PCA as well as the evidence, the autosomal evidence I have shared thus far. Now, the only thing we are missing here is actually early Iranic as well as Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid era samples from Iran. Now, these samples will likely come out very soon, perhaps within a few years. But again, these samples will show there to be 90 to 95% genetic continuity in Iran since the Iron Age and debunk any claims to ancient Iranian civilization made by individuals such as Jason Reza, well, made by not Giorgiani, but made by individuals such as those associated with white nationalism, Afrocentrism, as well as deluded Iranians such as Jason Reza Giorgiani. And once those samples come out, I will make another update video. But I think this is the ultimate video on Iranian genetics and the genetics of the Iranian peoples, and it should definitely be saved and shared and spread. And I think most Iranians as well as Iranics need to see this video. So please do share and subscribe to my channel, and that is it for this video. But before I wrap up, I just wanted to say that the situation in South Asia, I wanted to share that as well because I find it interesting. The situation in South Asia is that most of the contemporary South Central Asian populations from the Northwest, such as myself, cluster with the Vedic Aryan samples. And this is mostly from Pakistan, among the upper castes, Indian upper castes as well, notably the Jats. But the Indian Brahmins are a bit more pulled towards ancestral South Indians. Nonetheless, they do cluster very closely to these samples, which I have highlighted here. So yes, the Vedic Aryans were very similar to modern day South Asians, and this proves a great deal of genetic continuity in South Asia as well. And that is it for this video. Please share, please. I would like to thank you if you watch this to the end, and again, I appreciate it loads, and I hope that you share, subscribe, and spread the word. Thank you.